Inside ADX Florence, America's most isolated prison built to break the unbreakable. The concrete silence. In the high desert of southern Colorado, approximately 100 miles south of Denver, stands the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, commonly known as ADX Florence. It is the most secure federal prison in the United States. Opened in 1994 and operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, ADX was designed for inmates the federal system classifies as the highest security risks. Those housed here include individuals convicted of terrorism, espionage, organized crime leadership, and violent offenses committed within other prisons. But the defining feature of ADX Florence is not who is inside. It is how they live. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, most inmates in the general population units at ADX spend approximately 23 hours per day alone in their cells. The cells measure roughly 7 by 12 feet. Each is constructed almost entirely of reinforced concrete. The bed is a poured concrete slab. The desk is poured concrete. The stool is poured concrete. A stainless steel sink and toilet combination is fixed to the wall. Showers operate from outside the cell, controlled electronically by staff. There are no bars. The door is solid steel. A narrow vertical window, often described as 4 inches wide, is positioned so that the inmate cannot see the surrounding landscape, only a sliver of sky. The design is intentional. Former Bureau of Prisons officials have publicly described ADX as a facility built to ensure that inmates cannot communicate with one another, cannot coordinate violence, and cannot exert influence beyond their cell walls. Movement is rare and tightly controlled. When an inmate leaves his cell, for a medical appointment, legal visit, or recreation, he is handcuffed and escorted by multiple correctional officers. Recreation, when granted, typically occurs alone. Outdoor recreation takes place in what inmates and attorneys have described in court filings as recreation cages, individual enclosures surrounded by concrete and metal fencing, open only to the sky above. There is no shared yard. Inmates do not eat together. Meals are passed through a slot in the steel door. Communication with other inmates is prohibited. Silence becomes structural. The Bureau of Prisons refers to this model as control unit housing. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have classified prolonged solitary confinement under conditions like those at ADX as extreme isolation. Court records from lawsuits filed by former inmates describe years spent with minimal human contact. In 2012, a group of inmates filed a federal lawsuit alleging that the conditions at ADX caused or worsened serious mental illness. The case, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, resulted in a 2016 settlement agreement requiring reforms in the screening and treatment of prisoners with diagnosed mental health conditions. As part of that settlement, the Bureau of Prisons agreed to changes including improved mental health evaluations and limitations on the placement of seriously mentally ill inmates in the most restrictive units. Even so, isolation remains the defining condition. Federal data indicates that inmates assigned to ADX are typically placed in a step-down program intended to gradually transition individuals to less restrictive environments. Advancement depends on behavior, compliance, and evaluations conducted by prison staff. The process can take years. Some inmates remain at ADX for a decade or longer. Psychological research published in peer-reviewed journals has documented the effects of long-term solitary confinement, including anxiety, depression, cognitive disturbances, hypersensitivity to stimuli, and difficulties with social interaction after release from isolation. Courts in the United States have acknowledged these findings in various rulings, though the Supreme Court has not declared solitary confinement unconstitutional per se. Former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, in a 2015 concurrence in Davis v. Ayala, wrote separately to highlight concerns about prolonged solitary confinement, describing the human toll of extended isolation. At ADX, isolation is not incidental. It is structural. Cells are sound insulated to reduce the ability to shout between units. In many housing ranges, inmates cannot see one another at all. Lights are controlled from outside. The daily schedule is predictable and repetitive. Wake up. Meal delivery. Limited recreation. Count. Silence. According to publicly available Bureau of Prisons documents, ADX houses several units with varying levels of restriction, including the general population units, the special security unit, and the so-called H unit, which has been reported to hold inmates requiring additional monitoring. Each level maintains separation as a core principle. There are no communal work programs in the traditional sense. Educational programming is limited and delivered through correspondence or in-cell materials. Religious services, when permitted, are typically conducted through closed-circuit television. Contact visits are not allowed. Non-contact visits occur through thick glass partitions. Physical touch is absent. The prison's architecture enforces distance. Control is layered, physical, procedural, psychological. ADX Florence is often described in media as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but unlike Alcatraz, which closed in 1963, ADX was built with modern surveillance systems, reinforced concrete construction, and electronic controls designed to eliminate vulnerability. In congressional testimony and Bureau of Prison statements, officials have maintained that ADX is necessary to manage inmates who have demonstrated violence towards staff or other prisoners, or who have directed criminal enterprises from within prison walls. The facility was constructed after high-profile incidents in the 1980s, including the 1983 murders of 2 federal correctional officers at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, an event that accelerated the federal government's shift toward permanent lockdown models for its most dangerous inmates. ADX represents the culmination of that shift. For the men inside, time is measured differently. Days are marked not by movement through space, but by repetition within it. A cell. A tray slot. A narrow window to the sky. Isolation at this scale does not rely on noise or visible force. It relies on removal. Removal from others. Removal from touch. Removal from unpredictability. The structure is engineered to eliminate variables. What remains is routine. And silence. Control by design. ADX Florence was not built as a response to a single event. It was the product of a shift in federal correctional philosophy. In October 1983, 2 correctional officers were killed in separate incidents at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. In response, Marion was placed under permanent lockdown. That lockdown model, characterized by extreme isolation and restricted movement, became a prototype. A decade later, ADX Florence institutionalized that model at scale. The Bureau of Prisons describes ADX as an administrative maximum facility. The designation reflects its purpose: to confine inmates who require the highest level of security control within the federal system. Assignment to ADX follows a formal review process. Inmates are typically transferred after incidents involving violence, escape attempts, or conduct deemed a threat to institutional safety or national security. A hearing is conducted, and the inmate receives notice of the reasons for referral. Final placement decisions are made at the Bureau's Designation and Sentence Computation Center. Once at ADX, classification determines housing. The facility operates through a structured level system. Most inmates enter through the control unit or special housing unit, where restrictions are at their most severe. Advancement occurs through what the Bureau calls the step-down program, a multi-phase progression designed to evaluate compliance and behavior over time. Each phase permits incremental increases in privileges. Movement from one phase to the next can take months or years. Failure to comply with institutional rules can result in regression. According to Bureau of Prisons policy statements and court records, criteria for progression include clear conduct, participation in assigned programming, and demonstrated adjustment to the institution's expectations. Programming at ADX differs from traditional federal prisons. There are no group classes in a shared classroom. Instead, educational materials are delivered to cells. Assignments are completed alone. Mental health services, when provided, often occur at the cell door or through secure booths. Clinical staff conduct regular rounds. In the 2016 Cunningham settlement, the Bureau agreed to enhanced mental health screening procedures, including the identification of inmates with serious mental illness prior to placement in the most restrictive units. The settlement required periodic evaluations and the development of alternative housing pathways for inmates whose psychiatric conditions could be worsened by prolonged isolation. These reforms followed years of litigation documenting cases in which inmates with diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder were confined under ADX conditions. Court filings describe behaviors such as self-harm and psychotic symptoms. The Bureau of Prisons did not concede constitutional violations in the settlement but agreed to policy adjustments. Today, the Bureau maintains that inmates with severe mental illness are diverted from the most restrictive housing whenever appropriate. Yet the structure of ADX remains rooted in control. Each housing unit is monitored from secure control rooms. Doors open electronically. Movement is scheduled. Staff communicate through radios and secure intercom systems. Physical keys are minimal. Human discretion operates within strict procedural frameworks. Even recreation follows a mechanical pattern. An inmate is notified. Restraints are applied. He is escorted through controlled corridors. Placed alone in a concrete enclosure. Returned after the allotted time. The process repeats. Communication with the outside world is similarly regulated. Telephone access is limited and monitored. Mail is screened. Legal visits occur through non-contact arrangements. Attorneys representing ADX inmates have reported in court filings that conversations occur through glass partitions using telephones. The physical barrier remains constant. The Bureau of Prisons argues that these measures are necessary. Among the inmates housed at ADX have been individuals convicted of directing large-scale drug trafficking networks from prison, organizing gang activity across state lines, or engaging in acts of terrorism. Federal officials have testified before Congress that ADX is designed to neutralize influence. The goal is incapacitation through isolation. In public statements, the Bureau emphasizes safety, for staff, for other inmates, and for the public. At ADX, the margin for unpredictability is reduced to near zero. Inmates do not gather in communal dining halls. They do not share recreation yards. They do not work in prison industries alongside others. The architecture limits opportunity. But control extends beyond architecture. It is procedural. Every action, meal delivery, medical visit, recreation period, is documented. Counts occur multiple times per day. Surveillance cameras operate continuously. Inmates are aware that observation is constant. In depositions and affidavits submitted in federal litigation, former inmates have described the sensation of being watched but rarely seen, monitored for compliance rather than engaged in conversation. The Bureau of Prisons disputes characterizations that describe ADX as sensory deprivation. Cells are illuminated. Inmates possess reading materials. They may own limited personal property, including religious texts and approved books. Yet the defining absence remains interaction. Former wardens have publicly stated that ADX is not intended as punishment beyond the sentence imposed by the court. It is intended as management. But management at ADX is inseparable from isolation. The step-down structure presents a path forward. For some inmates, progression occurs. For others, disciplinary infractions, sometimes minor, interrupt advancement. Each infraction is processed through administrative procedures. Each decision is recorded. Time accumulates. A year. 5 years. 10. The average length of stay at ADX has varied over time, and the Bureau does not routinely publish detailed breakdowns of individual durations. What is documented is that some inmates have remained in highly restrictive conditions for more than a decade. In federal court opinions reviewing ADX conditions, judges have acknowledged the severity of the environment. They have also deferred to prison administrators on matters of security, provided constitutional minimums are met. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Litigation has repeatedly asked whether extreme isolation crosses that threshold. Federal courts have generally ruled that, absent proof of deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, ADX's structure does not, in itself, violate constitutional standards. So the system continues. Concrete. Steel. Procedure. Inside ADX Florence, control is not improvised. It is engineered. Every corridor, every door, every schedule reflects a singular objective. Eliminate risk. Contain influence. And maintain order through separation. Time without movement. In a conventional prison, time is structured by movement. Inmates walk to chow halls. They report to work assignments. They attend classes. They stand in line. They wait in shared spaces. At ADX Florence, time is structured differently. Movement is limited. Space is fixed. For most inmates in the general population units, daily life unfolds within the same 7 by 12-foot cell. The Bureau of Prisons outlines a standardized schedule. Lights on. Morning count. Meal delivery. Program review. Afternoon count. Recreation if scheduled. Evening meal. Final count. Lights dimmed. The sequence repeats. In court records and sworn declarations, former inmates have described the sensation of days blending together. Without shared meals, without work shifts, without physical proximity to others, temporal markers narrow to institutional routines. The window provides limited orientation. Architectural design restricts the view to sky rather than landscape. There is no visible horizon, no passing traffic, no seasonal reference beyond changes in light. The intent, according to Bureau planning documents and administrative statements, is security. Visibility outward could compromise control. Sightlines are engineered inward. Inmates may request reading materials through approved channels. Books are screened. Periodicals are permitted within guidelines. Educational correspondence courses are available, though participation depends on security classification and behavior. Assignments are completed alone at the concrete desk. Completed materials are collected through the food slot or during scheduled exchanges. There are no classroom discussions. No shared tables. Mental health staff conduct rounds. Clinical encounters often occur at the cell front. A psychologist or counselor stands outside the steel door, speaking through the narrow opening or through a secure intercom. Documentation from the Cunningham litigation detailed how such interactions were sometimes brief, structured, and limited by security protocol. Following the 2016 settlement, the Bureau implemented revised procedures for identifying inmates whose psychiatric conditions required alternative placements. Even so, for inmates not classified as seriously mentally ill, isolation remains the baseline condition. Human contact is measured in minutes. A correctional officer conducting count. A nurse distributing medication. An escort team applying restraints. In depositions, former staff members have described ADX as quiet compared to other high-security prisons. Noise levels are lower. There are no large recreation yards. No communal television rooms. Sound does not carry easily between cells. Some housing units were constructed with sound dampening features specifically to reduce communication between inmates. The effect is cumulative. Psychological research on prolonged solitary confinement has identified patterns associated with extended isolation. Studies published in journals such as the American Journal of Public Health and Law and Human Behavior have documented increased risks of depression, anxiety disorders, hypersensitivity to stimuli, and difficulties with concentration among inmates subjected to long-term segregation. These findings have been cited in federal court decisions evaluating solitary confinement practices. The Bureau of Prisons acknowledges that isolation can be challenging but maintains that ADX is reserved for inmates who present extraordinary security concerns. The official position emphasizes necessity. The institutional logic is preventative. Within the cell, routines become personal anchors. In affidavits submitted in federal cases, inmates have described structuring their days around reading, exercise in place, prayer, or letter writing. Push-ups beside the bed. Walking short laps from door to wall. Stretching in limited floor space. Repetition replaces variety. Some inmates document calendars by marking paper. Others measure time by legal filings. Motions submitted, responses received, appeals pending. The legal process becomes one of the few dynamic elements in an otherwise static environment. Mail call interrupts the pattern. Envelopes are inspected. Pages are counted. Correspondence is delayed by screening procedures. Telephone calls, when authorized, are monitored and time-limited. The absence of spontaneous interaction alters perception. There is no informal conversation at meal lines. No shared commentary about weather. No incidental physical contact. At ADX, even accidental touch is rare. Former inmates have testified in court that extended isolation changed their tolerance for stimulation. Some reported heightened sensitivity to sound. Others described difficulty maintaining focus during conversations after transfer to less restrictive units. These accounts appear in sworn statements and psychological evaluations submitted during litigation. Courts have weighed such evidence against the government's security rationale. Judicial opinions frequently acknowledge the severity of isolation while deferring to prison administrators on matters of safety and institutional control. The Constitution sets boundaries. Within those boundaries, policy defines daily life. At ADX Florence, policy is constant. The door remains closed. The window remains narrow. The corridor remains empty except for scheduled movement. Time passes but space does not change. There are no shifting landscapes. No communal calendars. No shared rituals beyond count and compliance. In this environment, endurance becomes procedural. Not dramatic. Not visible. Simply sustained. The system does not rely on overt force. It relies on structure. And structure, repeated without interruption, becomes the experience itself. The step-down path. ADX Florence is designed for permanence. But it is not officially defined as permanent placement. The Bureau of Prisons operates what it calls the step-down program. The program was formalized to provide a structured path from the most restrictive housing toward less restrictive federal facilities. Entry into ADX often begins in highly controlled units. Advancement requires sustained compliance with institutional rules. The process is incremental. In Bureau policy documents, The step-down program is described as a behavior-based system. Inmates progress through multiple phases. Each phase introduces limited increases in privilege. The earliest phases permit little deviation from standard isolation. Meals remain in cell. Recreation remains solitary. Communication remains restricted. As progression occurs, inmates may receive slightly expanded out-of-cell time, increased access to programming materials, or limited group interaction under supervision. Movement between phases is not automatic. Reviews are conducted periodically by institutional staff. Behavioral records are evaluated. Disciplinary infractions can delay advancement. Serious rule violations can result in regression to earlier phases. The system is documented, reviewed, and recorded. In federal court filings, the Bureau has described the program as an incentive structure. Compliance becomes the primary currency. The expectation is sustained stability. Some inmates move through the program over a period of several years. Others remain in early phases much longer. Publicly available Bureau data does not publish detailed timelines for individual cases, but court records confirm that durations vary significantly. Inmates convicted of terrorism-related offenses, for example, have historically been housed in specialized units within ADX. In 2018, the Bureau of Prisons announced changes to the housing of certain terrorism-designated inmates, including integration into other general population units within ADX rather than separate concentration in a single unit. The stated purpose was to reduce the risk of ideological reinforcement among similarly convicted individuals. Even within these policy adjustments, isolation remains central. Group activities are tightly controlled. Interaction, when permitted, is structured and supervised. The step-down program does not remove isolation entirely. It modifies it. Documentation from the Cunningham settlement required enhanced mental health assessments throughout the progression process. Under the agreement, inmates demonstrating serious psychiatric deterioration could be transferred to alternative facilities with greater clinical resources. The Bureau implemented screening tools and required periodic reassessment. Independent monitoring occurred for a defined period following the settlement. These measures were designed to prevent the placement of severely mentally ill inmates in the most restrictive conditions without review. Yet for those deemed stable under Bureau criteria, the structure remains unchanged. Compliance is observed. Reports are written. Committees review. Advancement is considered. From an institutional perspective, the program serves multiple functions. It offers a mechanism to evaluate whether an inmate can function safely in a less restrictive environment. It creates documented benchmarks. It reinforces the message that progression is possible. From the inmate's perspective, progression can be uncertain. Affidavits submitted in federal litigation have described the review process as opaque. The Bureau has maintained that decisions are based on documented conduct and security assessments. Judicial opinions reviewing ADX placement have generally upheld the Bureau's authority to determine appropriate housing for inmates classified as high risk. The courts require procedural fairness. They do not typically substitute their judgment for prison administrators on security matters. Within this framework, the step-down program becomes the only structured pathway outward. Transfer out of ADX does occur. Inmates who complete all phases and demonstrate sustained compliance may be redesignated to high-security penitentiaries elsewhere in the federal system. The decision is administrative. It follows review. It is not guaranteed. For those who remain, years accumulate within the same perimeter fence. The Rocky Mountains remain visible beyond the razor wire. Inside, corridors remain unchanged. Doors open and close electronically. Movement occurs under escort. At ADX Florence, release from isolation is not abrupt. It is gradual, conditional, and documented. The structure does not collapse. It recalibrates. Control remains the foundation. Progression, when it occurs, unfolds within that framework. The system was built to contain individuals deemed unmanageable elsewhere. Its defining characteristic is separation. Its promise is that separation can eventually be reduced. Whether that promise is realized depends on policy, documentation, and time. After isolation. Isolation at ADX Florence is not limited to the present moment. Its effects extend beyond the perimeter fence. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that placement at ADX is driven by security necessity. The courts have generally affirmed the Bureau's discretion, provided procedural safeguards are observed. Yet the broader consequences of prolonged isolation have increasingly become part of public record. In sworn testimony, Former inmates transferred out of ADX have described difficulties adjusting to environments that include routine social interaction. Psychological studies on long-term solitary confinement, including research cited in federal litigation, have documented challenges such as heightened anxiety in group settings, difficulty with concentration, and sensitivity to noise. These findings are not unique to ADX. They appear across studies of extended segregation in multiple correctional systems. What distinguishes ADX's duration? Years in some documented cases. The Bureau's step-down program is designed to ease transition. Inmates nearing transfer to other facilities may participate in limited group programming under supervision. Gradual increases in out-of-cell time are introduced. The structure attempts to recalibrate. Still, the transition from near-total isolation to a conventional high-security penitentiary can be abrupt. Federal courts have acknowledged that solitary confinement may carry psychological consequences, but constitutional standards focus on deliberate indifference and basic human needs. Judges have repeatedly emphasized that prison administration involves complex security decisions. In this balance, ADX continues to operate. For inmates serving life sentences, ADX may represent an indefinite chapter rather than a temporary placement. For others, it is a segment within a longer custodial trajectory. Release directly from ADX to the community is rare but has occurred. When it does, reintegration unfolds under federal supervision. Probation officers assume responsibility. Conditions of release apply. The individual exits a highly controlled environment and enters a society defined by unpredictability. There are no published comprehensive longitudinal studies tracking post-release outcomes specifically for former ADX inmates. What exists are individual case records, appellate filings, and interviews conducted by journalists and researchers. These accounts suggest adjustment can be complex, but they remain individualized. The institution itself does not narrate these outcomes. Its function ends at custody. Inside the non-contact visitation room, interaction remains mediated. Telephone. Observation. Legal representation provides one of the few sustained external connections. Attorneys have challenged placements. They have filed habeas petitions. They have argued that isolation, when prolonged, crosses constitutional boundaries. Courts have required documentation. The Bureau has provided records. Decisions have been issued. The process is procedural. Outside advocacy organizations continue to debate the ethics and necessity of Supermax confinement. Some argue that extreme isolation should be limited in duration. Others contend that certain inmates present risks that cannot be mitigated through less restrictive means. Congress has held hearings on solitary confinement practices within federal prisons. Policy discussions continue. Inside ADX Florence, however, debate is not visible. The routine remains intact. Morning count. Meal slot. Escorted movement. Concrete walls. Narrow window. For staff, ADX represents an assignment within the federal correctional system. For inmates, it represents the most restrictive level of confinement available in federal custody. The institution was built to contain individuals considered uncontrollable elsewhere. Its design reflects that mandate. Control through separation. Order through restriction. Silence through structure. The broader question, how isolation shapes the human experience over years, remains examined through litigation, research, and policy review. The prison itself does not articulate conclusions. It operates. Doors open. Doors close. The corridor remains still. Beyond the perimeter fence, the landscape of southern Colorado continues unchanged. Inside, time advances in measured intervals. Not marked by movement across distance, but by the repetition of routine within concrete boundaries. And for those housed there, endurance is defined not by spectacle, but by continuation. The architecture of finality. ADX Florence was constructed to solve a specific problem. How do you contain individuals the federal system has determined cannot be safely managed anywhere else? The answer in 1994 was architectural. Concrete. Steel. Distance. Control layered through design. Over the past 3 decades, the facility has housed inmates convicted of terrorism, espionage, organized crime leadership, and repeated violence within other institutions. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that its purpose is protection. Protection of staff. Protection of other inmates. Protection of the public. Federal courts have reviewed its conditions. Litigation has challenged its methods. Reforms have been ordered. Policies have been adjusted. Yet the core structure remains. 23 hours a day inside a single cell. Movement and restraints. Communication mediated by glass. Recreation alone. Silence engineered into walls. Research continues to examine the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Judges continue to weigh constitutional limits. Advocates continue to debate necessity and ethics. Correctional officials continue to defend security priorities. ADX Florence exists at the center of that tension. It is not chaos. It is not disorder. It is discipline extended to its furthest boundary. For the men housed there, time is defined by compliance reviews, count procedures, and incremental evaluations. For the staff, it is defined by protocol and vigilance. For policymakers, it represents the outer edge of incarceration policy in the United States. The prison does not announce itself. It does not perform. It operates quietly, consistently, behind reinforced doors, beyond layered fencing, out of public view. Whether ADX Florence represents necessary security or excessive isolation remains a matter of public record, legal argument, and personal perspective. What is documented is this. It is the most restrictive prison in the federal system. It was built to isolate, and it continues to do exactly that. If this examination has informed your understanding of how extreme confinement functions inside the United States, consider continuing the conversation. Share your perspective respectfully in the comments. Engage with the evidence. Discuss the policy. Support factual, documented reporting on incarceration systems. And if you value disciplined, research-based prison documentaries grounded in verified records, subscribe to follow future investigations. The story of ADX Florence is not concluded by a closing gate. It remains part of an ongoing national discussion about punishment, security, and the limits of isolation. Beyond the fence line, the landscape is open. Inside, the structure stands, unchanged, silent, and still.